There are seasons in every family's life, seasons full of noise, movement, and constant activity, and seasons where everything seems to soften into a quiet rhythm. For years, the Duggar family lived in a world filled with the kind of noise only a big family can create. Children laughed in the hallways, conversations overlapped at the dinner table, footsteps echoed across wooden floors, and the home carried an energy that could only come from more than a dozen lives unfolding side by side. But time has a way of reshaping everything, even the busiest homes. And as the months and years passed, something subtle began to happen within the Duggar family. The noise softened. The routines changed. The faces that once appeared every day grew quieter, more distant, more reflective. It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, like the fading of a sunset, soft, gentle, almost unnoticed until the darkness appeared. For those who had watched the Duggar family for years, this change was surprising. The daughters who once seemed inseparable were now rarely seen together. The sisters who once appeared in every family photo were absent from new updates. The vibrant, youthful faces that filled television screens and social media feeds quietly drifted away into their own worlds. People began to ask questions. They wondered if something had gone wrong, if there had been pain or conflict, or if the sisters had pulled away from the family entirely. But the truth was quieter, gentler, and far more human. Life had changed. The family had grown, and the daughters had entered a new season one that didn't need to be photographed or shared with the world. It was the kind of season every woman knows intimately, a season of adulthood, responsibility, and quiet transformation. There was a time when the Duggar home was the center of everything. Every daughter lived within walking distance of her siblings. Every celebration took place under the same roof. Every ordinary moment, breakfast, chores, bedtime, felt like part of a larger rhythm. But as the daughters became women, the rhythm shifted. They married, moved into new homes, created new routines, and began raising their own children. The world that once revolved around the early Duggar home now revolved around small kitchens, small living rooms, and the soft footsteps of little ones learning to walk. Motherhood changes everything in a woman's life. Suddenly, there is less time for updates, less energy for photos, and less desire to share every moment with the world. Days become filled with ordinary, beautiful tasks: folding laundry, calming a crying baby, cooking simple meals, teaching children, and finding a new identity in the middle of it all. The camera doesn't capture these moments. They belong only to the women living them. And so, the sisters slowly stepped away from public view. Not because something was wrong, but because life became full of responsibilities, full of new seasons, full of quiet joys that needed no audience. Some daughters moved farther away, building homes in new cities with new routines. Others stayed closer, but became absorbed in the rhythm of motherhood. Some needed privacy for emotional reasons. Others simply wanted a calmer pace of life. But all of them, in their own way, stepped into adulthood in a world that no longer required daily visibility. To the outside world, this looked like disappearance. But to them, it felt like growing up. There were mornings when one of the sisters might step out onto her porch, coffee in hand, feeling the cool breeze of early sunlight, and thinking about how different life looked now compared to the home she grew up in. No cameras, no constant responsibilities, no shared chores with a dozen sisters, just a quiet home and the peaceful responsibility of caring for her own children. And in those moments, she understood that silence does not mean distance. Silence often means presence in the places that matter most. As the sisters moved into these new seasons, something else happened. The connections between them became more private, but no less meaningful. Text messages shared in late evenings, phone calls during stressful days, quiet visits where children played together in backyards. shared advice about motherhood, conversations filled with laughter over past memories. They might not appear together in pictures as often, but the threads of sisterhood continued to weave their way through their lives. Quietly and beautifully, the world missed the big group photos, but the family didn't need them to stay connected. Some of the daughters also entered seasons of inner growth, reflecting on their childhood, understanding their own identities, and forming boundaries that felt healthy for their emotional well-being. These seasons were not dramatic. They were personal. Not everything needed to be said out loud. Some changes lived in the heart, unfolding in a quiet dignity that didn't require public explanation. And so the silence deepened, not as an absence, but as a gentle shield around their lives. To the viewers who had watched the Duggar sisters from afar, this silence created questions. But to older women, mothers, grandmothers, women who had lived through their own journeys, the silence felt familiar. They understood how life shifts, how daughters grow, how families change, how the seasons of life soften into quieter, deeper places. The Duggar sisters weren't fading away. They were becoming women in the most ordinary, most beautiful ways. And the first chapter of this story begins not with a mystery, but with a quiet truth. Life grows. Seasons change. And the girls the world once watched every day had stepped into another chapter, one written not for the world, but for themselves. As the seasons continued to change within the Duggar family, one of the earliest signs of that quiet transformation appeared not through words, but through something far more subtle, through photographs. For years, the Duggar sisters had grown up in front of cameras. Family photos were familiar, celebrations were documented, and moments were shared with the world almost instinctively. But slowly, something began to shift. New family albums appeared, yet certain faces were missing. Gatherings were posted online, but not everyone stood in the frame. Birthdays, holidays, and reunions came and went, leaving viewers wondering where some of the sisters had gone. It wasn't a sudden disappearance. It was the quiet fading of familiar faces, gentle enough to go unnoticed at first. But as time went on, people began to ask questions. Why wasn't she in the last family photo? Why hadn't she posted about Christmas? Why did an event that once included everyone now feel incomplete? The absence wasn't loud, but it was present like a shadow lingering just beyond the camera's edge. But the truth behind those disappearing faces wasn't dramatic. It didn't come from conflict, distance, or division. It came from something much simpler, something far more universal. Life moved on. Adulthood rearranged the pieces of their world in ways that looked unfamiliar to outside eyes, but made perfect sense to the women living. Through it, there was a time when the Duggar sisters were almost always in the same place at the same time, growing up side by side. But adulthood scattered them like seeds in the wind. One moved to a new state, finding comfort in a different landscape. Another embraced motherhood with such devotion that her days rarely extended beyond her home's four walls. A third found peace in privacy, choosing not to share moments online. A fourth discovered a new identity, shaped by reflection and faith. The photographs didn't capture these transformations, but the absences did. In earlier years, family photos showed long lines of siblings shoulder to shoulder, smiling in coordinated outfits or gathered around a birthday cake. Now, those same photos told quieter stories. A sister missing because her child was sick. Another missing because her husband had work commitments. Another absent because distance made travel difficult. And some missing simply because they no longer felt the need to share every gathering with the world. What people saw as disappearance was, in reality, the emergence of private lives filled with routines, responsibilities, and moments that belonged only to the family members themselves. Sometimes one of the daughters would scroll through old pictures on her phone, She'd see images of childhood holidays when everyone was there, birthdays filled with laughter, afternoons spent cooking together in a kitchen that once felt too small for the number of people inside it. Those photos carried a warmth that wrapped around her heart like a memory she could almost step inside. But then she'd look around her own living room, see her own children playing, hear the soft voice of her husband asking about dinner, and she'd realize something important. Life had changed, but it hadn't lost its meaning. The new photos she took weren't meant for the world. They were snapshots of her child's first steps, of late-night cuddles, of laundry folded on the couch, of books scattered across the living room floor. They were moments too precious, too intimate, too personal to post. And so, her social media grew quiet. Her public presence faded. The world saw silence, but she saw life unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. For older women watching, this shift felt familiar. They remembered when their own daughters married, moved away, and built their own homes. They remembered the phone calls that replaced daily conversations, the rare family gatherings that grew more precious each year, the joy of seeing grandchildren mixed with the soft ache of knowing the house would never again be full in the same way. They understood the kind of silence that comes from growth, from distance, from love. And yet, despite the changes, the connection between the sisters remained. There were group messages that buzzed with updates, late-night texts offering support, pictures shared privately from one home to another, long voice messages describing motherhood struggles, victories, and everything in between. They stayed connected not through public photos, but through private conversations that the world would never see. Even when they couldn't be physically present in a family picture, they were present in each other's hearts. After all, sisterhood isn't measured by the number of photos taken together. It is measured by the number of memories held, the number of secrets shared, and the number of times they show up for advice, for comfort, for laughter, for love. And somewhere deep inside, every sister was the quiet understanding that things weren't the same as before. The big gatherings of their youth were now replaced by smaller celebrations, sometimes too small to capture on camera. But the love between them remained steady, like a quiet river flowing underneath the surface. There were evenings when one of the sisters would sit on the edge of her bed after putting her children to sleep, thinking about how different life had become. She might scroll through a recent family photo that someone else had posted seeing her siblings, nieces, nephews, and parents gathered for a holiday she couldn't attend. She would smile, perhaps feel a small pinch of longing, but then look at her own sleeping child and know she was exactly where she needed to be. Distance didn't diminish love. And absence didn't erase connection. In the end, the missing faces in photos weren't signs of something wrong. They were signs of life, messy, beautiful, evolving life. Signs that the Duggar sisters had stepped into seasons where photographs became private, where moments were lived rather than shared, where their stories unfolded behind closed doors and quiet blessings. Their disappearing faces were not evidence of loss. They were evidence of change, a change every woman experiences, a change every mother understands, a change that happens when the world outside becomes quieter, so that the world inside can grow. And so the camera captured less, but life held more. There is always a moment in every family story when one person takes the first quiet step away from the familiar. A step that doesn't break connection, doesn't remove love, but gently shifts the rhythm of life. In the Duggar family, that quiet first step was taken by one sister long before anyone fully realized it. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain it. She simply became a little quieter, a little more distant from the public eye, and a little more present in the world she was slowly building around herself. It began softly. One fewer photo, one missed gathering, one post that never arrived. People barely noticed at first. Life is busy. Schedules change. families grow. But with time, her silence became noticeable, not only to viewers, but to the family itself. It wasn't concerning. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a sign that she had entered a new chapter. For this sister, adulthood brought with it a weight she hadn't expected. The responsibilities of building her own home, of caring for her children, of supporting her husband, of organizing a life outside the house she grew up in. It all came rushing in at once. The noise she once lived with faded into a different kind of noise. The sound of a baby crying at midnight, the hum of the washing machine, the clinking of dishes late in the evening when the rest of the house fell asleep. And in that new world, the pressure to be visible, to show up online, to share updates, to stay present felt too heavy. She didn't become distant from her family. She simply became closer to her own world. There were moments when she would wake up early in the morning, long before the sun had risen, and sit quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands. The house was silent in a way it never was during her childhood. She could hear the clock ticking softly on the wall, the refrigerator humming, the quiet breath of her baby sleeping in the next room. And in that silence, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: her own thoughts, her own heart, her own identity emerging from the background of a large family. The world had always known her as one of many, as a daughter in a big family, as a sister surrounded by siblings. But now she was discovering who she was when the noise stopped. It was a new experience, a little overwhelming at first, but also beautiful. She found herself becoming more reflective, more thoughtful, more aware of the small details in her life that had once gone unnoticed. And slowly, her presence in public began to fade. It wasn't a decision she made in a single moment. It happened gently, almost without intention. One day she forgot to take a picture. Another day, she didn't feel like writing a caption. Then there were days when her child needed her more than social media did. And before long, her page became quiet. Viewers noticed, and some worried. They wondered if she was struggling, if something had happened. But the truth was far simpler. She was living. Fully, deeply, quietly living. There were afternoons when she would take her child outside to play. The soft sunlight falling through the trees, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. She would watch her little one explore the world with curiosity and joy, and she realized that these were the moments she didn't want to interrupt with a camera. These were the moments she wanted to feel, not photograph. Her silence was not a withdrawal. It was a choice to be present. Her siblings understood. They saw the quiet exhaustion in her eyes when she visited. They saw the love she carried for her children. They saw the small sacrifices she made each day, sacrifices their own mother once made for them. They understood that this season of life left little room for public visibility, and so they embraced her silence with compassion. Sometimes, late at night, she would receive a message from one of her sisters. Just a simple check-in. How are you doing? Are you okay? How is the baby sleeping? These messages were reminders that even though she had stepped into a quieter life, she was never alone. There were also nights when she would sit with her husband and talk about how different their childhoods had been. He grew up in a smaller family where silence was normal. She grew up in a large, bustling home where silence was rare. Now, living in a small family of her own, she was learning to embrace a different kind of comfort, a comfort found in quiet evenings, in simple meals, in early bedtimes, in routines that belonged only to her small family of 3 or 4. Sometimes she missed the noise of her childhood home. She missed the laughter that rolled down the hallways like a warm wave. She missed the sound of her sisters talking late into the night. She missed the chaos of family gatherings. But she knew that those memories were part of her, forever held in the chambers of her heart. Even if her life looked different now, as more sisters stepped into similar seasons, her quietness no longer stood alone. It became part of a pattern of grown women choosing privacy, choosing peace, choosing homes built for their own children. And slowly, the world saw less of them. But behind the silence was a deeper story. It was the story of a sister who loved her family fiercely but needed room to breathe. A sister who carried her childhood with her, not as a burden, but as a foundation. A sister who learned to nurture her own family in the same gentle way she had once nurtured her siblings. A sister who understood that not every moment needed to be shared to be meaningful. The world saw a missing face. She saw a life finally becoming her own. And in that quiet transformation, she became the first to show something the others would soon discover. That adulthood, motherhood, and inner peace often arrive in silence. There is a moment in every family when one child drifts not out of love, but out of geography, when distance, and not emotion, becomes the reason a familiar face appears less often. In the Duggar family, one of the sisters stepped into that chapter long before anyone realized the impact it would have on the family's photographs. Gatherings and daily rhythm. Moving away is never simple, especially when you come from a family where everyone once lived so close were birthdays. Dinners, church mornings, and ordinary afternoons were once shared experiences. For this sister, the decision to move came from love, from marriage, from opportunity, from the natural progression of adulthood. Yet leaving the home she had known for her entire life carried emotions she never expected. The first weeks in her new city were filled with excitement. New places to explore, new routines to form, a new home to decorate with pieces that reflected her own taste, soft colors, framed photos, little reminders of where she came from. She learned the sound of her new neighborhood, a sound so different from the noise of the Duggar home. There were quiet mornings with sunlight through the blinds. Evenings where only two voices echoed through the living room. It felt peaceful, but also foreign. Sometimes on long drives, she found herself remembering the house she grew up in, the way the hallway always felt alive, the way her sisters' voices carried through the rooms, the way she could walk into the kitchen and always find someone there. She missed that sense of constant presence, that feeling of belonging to something big and shared. But she also felt proud of the life she was building, step by step, moment by moment. The distance became real the first time she missed a family gathering. It wasn't intentional. Life simply didn't allow her to travel that weekend. When the pictures were posted online, she looked at them with a soft smile. She saw her parents, her siblings, the familiar decorations, the familiar laughter frozen in a photograph. She felt a warmth in her heart, but also a small ache that whispered, "I wish I was there." It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't sadness. It was simply the realization that life had changed. For years, she had been present in every picture. Now she was beginning to appear less, not because she chose to step away, but because geography naturally reshaped her place in the family's story. Travel became harder as her own family grew. Packing bags for children took time. Long road trips were exhausting. Schedules overlapped. Holidays became complicated. Sometimes she visited only for a few days, sometimes only for the important events. And sometimes, when life felt overwhelming, she stayed home, carving out a celebration of her own with her husband and children. At first, her absence in photos confused viewers. People asked where she was, why she wasn't appearing, why the once present sister had become the quiet face missing from the frame. They didn't see the miles between homes. They didn't see the effort required to travel with toddlers. They didn't see the nights she stayed awake, missing her family, but knowing she had made the right choice for her own. There were times she would sit on her couch scrolling through new family pictures, smiling as she recognized every face. Her sisters holding their babies, her brothers laughing with their children, her parents standing proudly among the generations. She loved seeing those images, even when she was not in them, because the love she felt didn't need her physical presence to stay alive. Distance did not push her away. It simply placed her in a different chapter. When she visited home, she brought her children to the backyard where she once played as a little girl. She watched them run in the same grass, touch the same old trees, learn the same melody of childhood laughter. Those moments reminded her that even though life had carried her far, the root of who she was could always be found here. She would look at her mother standing in the kitchen, smiling as she cooked for the family, and suddenly feel like a little girl again. She would hug her father and feel the strength that once guided her steps. She would sit with her sisters, talking late into the night about motherhood, marriage, and the quiet things they never posted online. Those visits were small but precious, filled with the kind of connection that doesn't fade even when time and distance stretch between hearts. And yet, the world outside saw only her absence. They saw the missing face in the holiday photo. They saw the empty space where she once stood. They saw the quietness of her social media. They didn't see the long phone calls she had with her mother. They didn't see the pictures she shared privately in family group chats. They didn't see the moments when her children asked to visit their cousins. They didn't see the prayers she whispered every night for her parents, her siblings, and their families. Distance does not erase love. It simply teaches it to grow differently. In her new city, she built traditions of her own: small dinners, simple birthdays, quiet evenings at home. She created a life shaped not by the constant noise of childhood, but by the soft rhythm of her own adulthood. There were moments when she felt a pang of longing, wishing she could attend every gathering. But she also knew that this life, this distance, this chapter was part of her story. Now her siblings understood. They missed her, but they also celebrated her life from afar. They welcomed her home every time with open arms, warm smiles, and the familiar laughter that stitched them together. And each time she visited, they made new memories that bridged the miles between them. She may not appear in every picture anymore, but her presence lives in the family's heart, in the stories they share, in the memories they hold, in the love that remains constant no matter the distance. Her story is not one of disappearance. It is a story of journey, a story of growth, a story of choosing a life that feels right. She didn't drift away from the family. She carried the family with her. There is a moment in every family's story when the heart begins to understand something that the mind has known for a long time. Children grow up. They grow beyond the familiar walls, beyond the rooms they once filled with laughter, beyond the routines that shaped their early lives. In the Duggar family, this moment arrived gradually, almost quietly, as each daughter and son stepped into a life of their own. But nowhere was this transformation felt more deeply than in the way new generations began to bloom inside and around their separate homes. With every new child born, the Duggar story expanded like ripples on a still pond. Grandchildren arrived one by one, each carrying a piece of history, each reflecting a familiar smile or a familiar softness. These children, innocent and unaware of the world their parents once grew up in, became the quiet center of each home. Their tiny hands wrapped around new routines, new rhythms, new beginnings. Their presence softened everything, turning once bustling homes into places where tender memories grew in silence. For the sisters, motherhood was both a continuation and a rediscovery. They remembered the lessons they learned growing up, lessons about patience, about kindness, about holding a crying child close when nothing else seemed to work. And yet, motherhood in their own homes felt different. It was more intimate, more personal, more vulnerable. There was no older sister to step in and help when the day became overwhelming. No shared chores, no community of siblings, just a mother, a baby, and the quiet hours that passed slower than they once did. There were nights when one sister sat in a dimly lit room long after midnight, rocking her restless baby back to sleep. In those hours, she thought about her own mother and wondered how she ever managed to care for so many children with such calmness. She realized that motherhood was not just about strength. It was about endurance, love, and the moments of stillness that only appear when a child finally falls asleep against your chest. For another sister, motherhood brought joy that filled her days to the brim, joy in small giggles. In tiny footsteps, in the sound of her child saying "Mama" for the very first time. She found beauty in the smallest routines, like packing lunch, reading picture books, and brushing little curls after a warm bath. These were the memories she cherished, the ones no camera could capture, the ones she did not want to share with the world, because they belonged only to her heart. There were days when the sisters would gather, in small groups, bringing their children together to play, to laugh, to learn. Those gatherings echoed the past in gentle ways, children running barefoot across a backyard, tiny voices calling out to one another, laughter floating in the afternoon air. Watching their own children form bonds reminded them of the deep connections they shared as siblings. Even if life had taken them in different directions, their children were creating new threads of closeness, stitching the family into the next generation. Some of the grandchildren grew up close to the original Duggar home, spending weekends climbing familiar trees, exploring the land, and listening to stories told by grandparents. Others grew up far away, where visits were less frequent, but no less meaningful. Michelle and Jim Bob treasured each visit, welcoming their grandchildren with open arms, warm hugs, and the endless patience that comes only with age. As the grandchildren grew, the presence of a new generation changed the rhythm of holidays and gatherings. The noise returned, not the overwhelming noise of nearly 20 children under one roof, but the sweet, chaotic noise of small cousins playing together, sharing snacks, and tumbling across living room floors. The sisters watched with soft smiles, seeing glimpses of their childhood reflected in the next generation. But with new life came something else, a quiet, unspoken shift in family priorities. Motherhood demanded time, energy, and emotional presence. It created distance, not out of desire, but out of necessity. The sisters began visiting less often, not because they didn't want to, but because traveling with young children was difficult. Schedules revolved around nap times, doctor appointments, and school routines. And slowly, family gatherings became smaller, more intimate, filled with fewer adults, but more little ones. The sisters understood that this was simply the way life moved. Families expand outward. Homes multiply. Traditions stretch and change. And the memories that once belonged to a single house become scattered across many homes, each filled with its own sweetness. There were moments of reflection. 2 moments when the sisters looked at their own children and wondered how their mother had carried the weight of so many lives at once. They felt a deeper respect for her sacrifice, her patience, her unwavering love. They realized that motherhood was not something you understood until you lived it. And when they lived it, they understood everything differently. They understood why their mother always encouraged them softly. They understood why she prayed over them every night. They understood why she held them tightly before letting them go. They understood the exhaustion behind her smile and the strength behind her quiet voice. Motherhood humbles everyone in the end. There were also days when the sisters felt alone, not emotionally, but physically. Days when they missed the companionship of their siblings. Days when they wished they could drop by their parents' home, even for a few minutes, to rest or to talk. Days when they longed for the comfort of the past. But those days were softened by the love they felt in their new families, by the tiny arms around their legs, the cheerful voices calling, "Mama," the quiet moments of gratitude that filled their hearts. No one knew this chapter better than Michelle and Jim Bob. They watched as their children balanced joy and exhaustion, and they saw pieces of their own youth reflected in every young parent. They stepped in when they could, offering encouragement, support, and the gentle wisdom earned through years of raising a family. Their home became a place of comfort, not as lively as before, but full of a warmth that came from knowing they had raised a family capable of raising families of their own. And though the world no longer saw every moment, every gathering, every celebration, the family continued to grow quietly in the background, one new baby at a time, one new home at a time, one new season at a time. The world saw less of the Duggar sisters, but the family saw more than ever, because the true expansion of the Duggar family happened not online, not in photographs, not on television, but in the hearts of the next generation, the children who were growing up with the same love their parents once received. And through their children, the Duggar story lived on, not louder, but deeper, not public, but personal, not documented, but felt. This new chapter was not one of disappearance. It was a chapter of beginnings, a chapter of tiny footsteps leading into the future. And the Duggar sisters, each in her own quiet world, carried the torch of motherhood, forward lighting the path for the new, little ones who would someday create memories of their own. There is a kind of silence that is not born from conflict or distance, but from life itself. A silence that comes softly, almost peacefully, as if settling over a family like a gentle blanket. In the Duggar family, this silent season began quietly, so quietly that most people didn't notice it at first. But as time passed, it began to shape the story of the sisters, the brothers, and the parents in a way that felt different from any chapter before. It was the kind of silence that comes when a family grows too large for one home to contain. When children spread across different states, different routines, different phases of adulthood. When the house that once held everyone now holds only memories. When new homes take the place of old hallways. When grandchildren's voices begin to fill the spaces where siblings once played. This silence wasn't empty. It was full of routines, responsibilities, new chapters, and unspoken love. As the years went by, one truth became clear. The Duggar sisters were no longer the young girls who once moved through their childhood home like a single unit. They were women now. Women with marriages, children, separate lives, separate dreams, and responsibilities that stretched far beyond the edges of the family they grew up in. Their silence grew not because they disappeared, but because they finally belonged to themselves. For some sisters, this silence came from building a home that required every ounce of their energy. There were mornings that began before sunrise, preparing breakfast, changing diapers, teaching young children, folding clothes, and managing endless little tasks that built the foundation of a mother's day. No one photographed these moments, yet these were the moments that shaped their lives more than anything. They were afternoons filled with the kind of ordinary miracles that never make it to social media. A child's first steps, a whispered prayer before nap time, a laugh that echoed in a quiet living room, cookies baked together in a sunlit kitchen. These moments weren't posted, but they were lived fully, deeply, quietly. For other sisters, silence came from emotional growth. They found themselves reflecting more than before, thinking more deeply about their childhood, about the traditions they loved, about the lessons they wanted to keep, and the ones they hoped to reshape for their own children. They needed time not to distance themselves, but to understand themselves. Sometimes, silence is a path to healing. Sometimes, silence is a path to clarity. Sometimes, silence is a path to becoming. There were also sisters for whom the silence came from distance, physical distance. Living far away meant missing gatherings, missing photos, missing moments that were captured without them. Not out of intention, but out of the reality that life stretches people in different directions. And yet, their absence in photos did not reflect an absence in the heart. In late-night phone calls with their siblings, They laughed just as they once did. In private group chats, they shared pictures of their children, stories from their week, moments of joy and exhaustion that the world would never see. They visited when they could, stayed connected however possible, and carried their family in their hearts across miles and states. The world saw their silence. The family saw their presence. For the brothers, too, life had moved into quieter places. Their days were filled with work, with building homes, with providing for their families. Their updates were fewer, not because they had less to share, but because their lives unfolded in a rhythm that did not require an audience. Their quietness was simply a reflection of who they had always been. And in the middle of all these changing seasons stood Michelle and Jim Bob, watching their family transform in ways they had never imagined. The house that once required constant attention now sat peacefully, filled with memories instead of noise. They watched their children come and go, bringing grandchildren, sharing stories, staying for weekends that felt too short. They learned to cherish each visit, each hug, each small conversation that reminded them of the days when everything happened under one roof. There were moments when Michelle would look at the empty chairs at the dining table and feel a soft ache, the ache of remembering what once was. But it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude mixed with nostalgia, because the empty chairs were not symbols of loss. They were symbols of growth, symbols of homes her children had built, symbols of new generations rising. Jim Bob felt the same. When he walked outside in the evenings and looked at the quiet yard, he remembered the times he ran through it with his children, teaching them, guiding them, laughing with them. He remembered the chaos, the unexpected moments, the challenges that turned into cherished memories. And now, in the quiet, he found a new kind of peace, knowing the seeds he planted were growing in homes far beyond his own. But even with all this understanding, the outside world remained curious. They wondered why the Duggar sisters had gone silent, why the photos showed fewer faces, why the updates became less frequent. Some speculated, some assumed. But the truth was simple and human. The sisters had grown into women whose lives no longer needed to be lived in the public eye. Their silence was not a secret. It was a boundary, an act of protection, an embrace of adulthood. And underneath that silence was a deep, unbroken connection, one that did not depend on photographs or posts. Connection lived in phone calls, private visits, shared prayers, and quiet laughter exchanged in living rooms that were no longer the same, but still filled with the same love. As grandchildren filled the family tree, the heart of the Duggar story shifted. It was no longer about the children who grew up together, but about the children they were now raising. New little hands held onto mother's skirts. New feet pattered across floors. New voices filled living rooms with the kind of innocence that only childhood can create. The story continued softer, slower, but richer. And even though the world could no longer see every moment, every sister, every gathering, those moments were still happening. Not on screens, but in real life. In the quiet of early mornings, in the warmth of family dinners, in the small smiles shared across rooms, in the gentle ways that love grows even when unseen. In the end, the silence of the Duggar sisters was not a disappearance. It was a transformation, a graceful step into lives that belonged to them. A reminder that not every chapter needs to be read aloud. Some chapters are meant to be lived quietly, held close, and remembered softly. And as this silent season settled across the family, it carried with it the softest message of all, that love does not fade when shared less publicly. It deepens, strengthens, and settles into the spaces where real life happens. As the years moved forward, and as the world grew quieter around the Duggar family, something gentle began to settle into place, a realization, a truth, a comforting understanding that the chapters of life do not end loudly. They end softly, gradually, like the fading of a familiar melody into the distance. And that was the kind of ending the Duggar sisters stepped into, a season not marked by finality, but by transformation. There was a time when their story unfolded in a bright public space, when every birthday, every announcement, every small milestone carried with it an echo that reached far beyond their home. People watched them grow, watched them change, watched them navigate the complexities of growing up inside a large and loving family. But the story they live now is quieter, deeper, more personal, and in many ways, far more beautiful. The silence that once puzzled people had become the very shape of their new lives. It was a silence filled with meaning, the meaning of raising children, the meaning of late-night worries and early morning routines, the meaning of finding their own identities, and the meaning of stepping into womanhood with grace. They were no longer the girls whose lives were shared with the world. They had become women whose lives were lived in the small, sacred moments of each day. For some of the sisters, the end of constant visibility felt like a gentle exhale, a release from the pressure to be present in a world that was always watching. In the quiet corners of their new homes, they found a peace that had once felt out of reach. They discovered what it meant to enjoy a slow afternoon, to sit on the porch with a cup of tea, to fold laundry while humming softly, to watch their children run barefoot in the yard. These were the moments that defined their adulthood, moments that could never fit into a photograph. For others, this new chapter brought a deeper sense of independence. Without the constant gaze of the outside world, they were free to explore the parts of themselves they had never fully understood. They learned to speak softly but firmly, to set boundaries, to choose their own paths, to build their own traditions. They grew into the kind of women who live not for the eyes of others, but for the love they hold inside their homes. And yet, even as each sister stepped into her own world, they carried their childhood with them. They carried the memories of growing up together, of braiding each other's hair, of cooking meals in a crowded kitchen, of laughing late into the night when the world outside was asleep. Those memories didn't fade. They simply sank deeper into their hearts, becoming the quiet foundation on which their new lives were built. Michelle and Jim Bob watched this transformation with the full weight of parenthood resting on their shoulders. They saw their children grow into adults who no longer needed them in the same way. And though there was an ache in that realization, there was also relief. It was the kind of ache that comes from knowing you did your job well, and the kind of relief that comes from seeing your children build lives full of meaning, purpose, and love. Their home, once filled with noise, now held a stillness that spoke of seasons past. But in that stillness, they found a new kind of joy. They found comfort in the evenings when the two of them sat together, looking at old photos, remembering the chaos that once felt overwhelming. They found joy in watching their grandchildren run across their yard, bringing the sound of childhood back into a home that had grown silent. And they found peace in knowing that although life had changed, love had never shifted. The grandchildren became the carriers of the next chapter, little ones who did not know the world their parents grew up in, but who inherited the same warmth, the same values, the same sense of family. They played under the same trees, sat at the same dinner table, listened to stories told with the same soft voice. And in them, the Duggar legacy found its quiet continuation. There were moments when the sisters gathered together again, not for cameras or events, but for simple visits. A meal shared around a small table, children playing in the background, conversations that drifted between laughter, memories, and the quiet admissions of adulthood that only sisters understand. These reunions were not always captured in photos, but they were felt deeply, profoundly. They were reminders that no matter how far life carried them, the bond they shared would never be undone. In these small reunions, they found themselves reflecting on how their lives had changed, They no longer lived under one roof. They no longer shared daily responsibilities. But they carried each other in their stories, in their thoughts, and their prayers. And even though they weren't seen together often, the love between them remained unbroken. Time has a unique way of revealing the truth behind people's journeys. And the truth behind the Duggar sisters' silence was simple. They chose peace. They chose privacy. They chose motherhood. They chose adulthood that looked different from the one people expected. And in choosing those things, they stepped into a version of themselves that was quiet, mature, and deeply authentic. Not every story needs to be seen to be real. Not every moment needs to be shared to be meaningful. Not every chapter needs publicity to matter. Some stories grow in the shadows of quiet homes. Some stories unfold in the hands of mothers rocking their children to sleep. Some stories live in the hearts of families who love each other silently. And that is where the Duggar family's new story lives now. Not in the noise of the past, but in the calm of the present. Not in the public eye, but in the private corners of their homes. Not in constant activity, but in the steady rhythm of love that continues, even when unseen. As this documentary reaches its end, there is a gentle truth to be understood. The Duggar family did not disappear. They simply grew into a season where life became deeper, quieter, and more precious. The sisters who once filled screens with their presence now fill their homes with their hearts. The home that once held 20 voices now holds memories that echo softly with time. The parents who once guided every moment now watch from a gentle distance. And the grandchildren who play in the yard carry the promise of tomorrow. This is not a story of endings. It is a story of becoming, a story of quiet strength, a story of life continuing in the softest, most beautiful ways. And so, the Duggar family moves forward, not with noise, not with attention, but with love. Always with love.